Morning, YouTubers. Today I thought I would do a welder recommendation video. Now the purpose of my channel isn't really to do welder reviews. There's plenty of guys that do that already that do a far better job, and it's just not something I'm really into. I mean, I have done some welder reviews that you've seen, but for the most part, I'm not really out here to do that. But I thought, why not give my recommendations on like a top 10 stick welder video so that you guys know what good equipment is and the differences, and just give you something to work with, because I know a lot of you are out there looking for a stick welder possibly, and is it worth it spending $1,000 versus $100? And I think we all know the answer. Better equipment is better, but how much better? Well, I'll give you a top 10 welders I would buy or that I recommend for you guys. So let's get into it. So before we talk about what machines I recommend, let's talk about some features that I think that you should have or that you should at least want. And that's what I have in front of us. The list really isn't in any particular order, so let's just get into it. Number one thing, and this I would say actually would be a number one, you want at least 120 amps. I've seen welders out there that are like 80, 90 amp stick welders. Honestly, don't even waste your time with those. If all your welding is like 1/8 inch thick steel and under, and that's it, okay, maybe. But when you're limited to like 80, 90 amps, the rods you can run are very limited. And then on top of that, the duty cycle, like how much you can weld in a given period, is probably going to be pretty poor with those. So, you just gluing something together in your shop, the machine's probably going to shut down due to thermal overload. You don't want that. So get a stick welder with at least 120 amps, preferably 180 amps. The higher the amperage is capable of, generally the better the duty cycle is at lower amperage. Now, hot start, a lot of stick welders have it, a lot of them don't. I would say it's probably 50-50. Hot start is something that comes with any higher end stick welder, and that's simply when you strike the rod, it ups the amperage for the first, say, half second or second, and then it drops down to your set point. So if you set it at 100 amps, it starts at 120, and after a half second, it goes back down to 100. Hot start makes it so much easier to start rods, especially 70-18s. Trust me, you want that. And I get it, if you're like on a budget and you can't afford a higher end machine, that you may not be able to get that. But if you can afford a machine that has hot start, it makes stick welding so much easier. So that's definitely something you want to look for. Now, arc force control, that's what Miller calls dig. A lot of people just call arc force. That's a control where the higher you set it, basically the tighter you cram the rod in, the smaller the arc gap, the higher the amperage gets boosted. And I did a whole video on that, so I won't go too in depth on it. I'll put a link in the description if you want to take a look at that. But the simple version is that if you set it for 100 amps and then you put the arc force at, say, 7 out of 10 or 70%, as you tighten the arc gap, it's going to boost the amperage up higher, so 110, 115 amps, to prevent A, the rod from sticking, and B, allows you to dig into the material like with 60-10, 60-11. So that's something, if you can get it, I would recommend it. It's an extra tool in your toolbox per se. Now, number 4, I know that a lot of us are home gamers and we don't have big shops and stuff. So having dual voltage capability is extremely handy. Now, a lot of the welders I'm going to personally recommend actually do have that. Some of them don't. What you have to remember is that if you, say, have a buddy that needs something repaired and he doesn't have a 240 volt outlet at his house or in his garage, having a dual voltage capability, especially on a more portable stick welder, is a great thing to have, because on a 20 amp circuit or even a 15 amp circuit, you might actually be able to weld with like 330, 270-18 and actually get something done. If your machine's 240 only, well, if someone doesn't have that voltage in their garage, you're pretty much stuck. So definitely I would recommend it. Now, number 5, which is a small size. The size You know, you look at the older stick welders like your Lincoln Tombstones, Miller Thunderbolts, and all those other ones that predate inverters, they're massive. They're not portable. And honestly, if it just sat in one place and you never moved it, like in your garage, okay, whatever, you can get away with those. But for me, at least personally, I find that, you know, I haul a stick welder around a little bit. You know, I have projects that I might do at somebody else's house, like I said, and carrying around something that weighs like 75 pounds or even worse, like an Ideal Arc 250 that weighs like 400 pounds is just, you can't do it as easily, or it's impossible. And I find that the newer inverters, the smaller size, they still, a lot of them output, you know, 160 to 200 amps. That's plenty of power to do any kind of stick welding you might need to do short of industrial. So I would recommend trying to find one with a smaller size. It's just more convenient. Now, number 6, I'm going to be honest, most welders don't have this, and that's stuck rod shutoff. With my Miller and most Millers that I've owned, if the rod sticks, a relay flips and it cuts the current, and it makes it very easy to break the rod off of the plate. Very handy thing to have. The unfortunate problem with this is that Miller and Fronius welders are the only ones that I'm aware of that have that. So basically, yeah, it's a nice feature to have, but you're kind of limited to what you can get that with. So that may or may not suit what you're looking for, especially because both of those companies' welders are pretty expensive. But it is something handy to have. I personally love it. Number 7, quality construction. Now, you get what you pay for generally in welders. I mean, when you compare a $1,000 stick welder to a $100 one, there's no question that the $1,000 one's going to be better overall. But how much better? Well, the quality construction, I want to compare, this is like a $100 Amazon welder's electrode holder and ground clamp. Now, this thing is actually very common on many cheap welders. It's the same electrode holder. It's okay, but this gets warm at like 120 amps. I can't imagine at 140-50 that this thing would probably start having issues with the plastic melting. When you compare it to better ground clamps like the solid bronze one, as well as your typical Lenco or better electrode holder, this doesn't get hot in your hand after a while at 120 amps. It has a lot stronger of a spring, so your rod sticks in it, and it has a lot more angles to where you can position the rod where you want it. Now, full disclosure, the Miller welder I have, I had to put these on it. Okay, it does not come with a set of leads. You can swap these onto a cheaper welder, but what you're gonna find is these two, the cost of them added to a cheap welder probably puts you in the ballpark, or at least close to more a better welder that already has it with it. So why would you buy a $100 welder, put $100 in accessories on it when you could have just bought a $250 or $300 welder and got them to begin with? Just something to think of. And it's not just the stinger and a ground clamp. When you look at better welders, like more expensive ones, the way that they're constructed is better. They're typically more durable. There's more thought process that went into it, and the duty cycles are generally better. Which brings me to number 8, solid duty cycle. When we all buy welders or tools, we think that, oh, well, we're only going to use this occasionally, so buy a cheap one. And then, well, next thing you find out is you bought a Harbor Freight tool, you're using it all the time, and it breaks after 3 months, which kind of negated the purpose of buying it, because, yeah, it was cheap, but if it only lasted a short amount of time, what good is it? And that's, you know, I guess if you're going to buy a cheap welder, don't be surprised if it doesn't last. That's, I guess, what I'll say with that. But you're better off buying well-known brand equipment, because if you don't want it down the line, you can always sell it off and probably make most of your money back, okay? Anyways, let's go on to 8. So solid duty cycle. The duty cycle is important because if you're going to do a large volume and you're planning on, I don't know, I'm not saying manufacturing, but you're planning on using it a lot, what you're going to find is a cheap welder A, isn't going to hold up, and B, it's probably going to go out on thermal overload fairly often where a bigger or more robust welder won't. And that's kind of a limitation of especially with the smaller machines. A lot of them don't have the greatest duty cycle. And I'll talk about that when I actually compare the welders or recommend them. But it's something to think of. You know, I generally assume worst case scenario, and I buy welders based on, you know, having to use them a fair amount. But I do a lot of side jobs and stuff for welding, so it makes sense for me. Number 9, 60-10 capability. So 60-10 rods will not run on most inverter welders, and they won't run on some transformer welders. 60-11 generally will, but what I find is any machine that has actual 60-10 capability will run 60-10, and they will run 60-11 better. So my recommendation is to find a welder that will weld with 60-10. Now, you cannot go by what an Amazon like product information says, because you go on there and every $100 stick welder says it'll weld 60-10, and that's simply not the case. I've proven that in my previous video where I reviewed a $100 stick welder, and guess what? It says 60-10, yet it won't run 60-10. So a true 60-10 capable stick welder is an important thing to have, because 60-10 is a great rod to use for scabbing material as well as for poor fit-ups. Couple more things here and then we'll get into actual welder recommendations. So DC output. Now, if you're on an extreme budget, or let's say you already have a Lincoln Tombstone welder that's AC only, well, that's what you're going to have to work with. But understand that AC only is going to somewhat limit your rod selection. It's going to limit the penetration your welds have. I saw that. I did a test AC versus DC, and the AC current had less penetration than DC. So that's something to think about. DC current, to me, I like the way it runs. It's not necessarily good for things like arc blow, but you can mitigate that in other ways besides, you know, running AC current. And DC is what pretty much everyone in industry uses. So if you can only run AC, trust me, if you ever want to go and be a welder, or you go on a job where it's required that you weld, very uncommon for people nowadays to have AC only machines. So get used to DC, and my recommendation is find a welder that has DC output. Number 11, set point accuracy. For the most part, if it's just going to be you in your shop fixing wood splitters or whatever, that's not a huge deal. You just set your machine based on what you see in the weld, okay? But if you're used to welding with a welder where the set points are all off, and then you hop on a stick welder where the set points are accurate, you're going to find that, you know, 100 amps isn't 100 amps on a quality machine compared to what you've been running. And I'm a stickler. If it has a setting, it should be accurate. I mean, otherwise, why have a set point? So you're going to find that cheaper, like $100 welders, the set points, what it says it is and what it actually is, are far apart. And you saw that if you watched my cheap stick welding video where I reviewed a welder. That thing was off by as much as 20% at points. So it's something to think of. Most better quality, like from Miller, ESAB, and Lincoln stick welders, they're all going to be pretty accurate. It's just when you get in the $100, $200 range, you're going to have issues. Now, the last thing, number 12, is electrical efficiency. This is something a lot of people don't think of, but it does play an interesting role. So if you have a dual voltage machine, like this is a cord for an ESAB welder where it allows you to hook your 240 volt to 120. If you get a portable small stick welder that's super efficient at converting your wall outlet power to welding current, you can run those and get maybe 110, 115, somewhere in the ballpark of that amperage out of that machine on a 20 amp circuit. When you look at the cheaper welders, like ones I reviewed before, you're going to get like 70, 80 amps out of them out of the wall before it trips a 20 amp breaker. That might not sound like a lot, but think of it. If you wanted to run, you know, a 332nd 7018 on a job at somebody else's house, and you're tripping a 20 amp breaker trying to run it on a cheap machine, that's a problem. Like, you're going to be limited to running very small, like 6013 rods. So my opinion is, like, the higher end welders generally have better efficiency. By getting one of those, it's going to open up a lot more opportunity, especially say you had a 15 amp circuit in a garage. Those are also less likely to trip a 15 amp as well. It's just something to think of. The old tombstones are stupidly inefficient, like they're probably 60%, so don't be surprised if the old transformer machines run up your electric bill if you use them a lot. Something to think of. All right, so let's get into my recommendations on machines that I think you guys should look at and possibly buy. So here's the list. Now, these are just stick-only welders. I'm not including multi-purpose welders that happen to be able to stick weld. So number 9 and number 10, because there's so many, I gave them 2 spots, are the Amazon and cheap Chinese import welders. Now, some of these are better than others, but they all kind of suffer from the same problems. And that's that they don't typically run 6010 despite saying they will. Their amperage output may or may not be accurate. The quality of the ground clamp and stinger, subpar generally, and just the build quality in general isn't that good. It's hard to recommend these higher simply because I guess they're not as good as anything else on this list. I mean, if all you got is $100, hey man, they'll do the job, and they might help you make some money and start a little welding business. But beyond that, I really wouldn't recommend them, especially if you want to rely on it. Coming in hot at number 8, the old Lincoln Tombstone. This is a AC only machine. Same thing as a Miller Thunderbolt. These old machines will last forever, especially the older copper wound ones. They're reliable. Their output is really good. I mean, they go over 200 amps on 240 volts, but they have a lot of downsides. One being they're highly inefficient, so they rob power from your wall and don't convert it into anything but heat. They have taps on a transformer, so the amperage is not really adjustable other than a specific taps, which, by the way, once these things heat up with use, you actually lose amperage. So 95 amps might become 85 after a bunch of use. Yeah, and they're not portable. I mean, good luck taking it with you somewhere. And the AC only is kind of a limitation. Not only do some rods not run on AC, but AC has less penetration than DC in my testing with stick rods. So again, this is an overall limiting machine. It'll get a job done, but not my preferred machine to use. Now we're getting to something a little bit more useful. This is very similar to the Tombstone that we just saw, but it has a full bridge rectifier on the output, so you actually have DC capability. My recommendation, if you want a Tombstone, get one of these. And the reason is simple. It gives you options. It still doesn't have the greatest duty cycle. It still has all the issues with losing amperage once it heats up. And it still draws a ton of power, isn't more portable, but the output of it is far more useful, and this will definitely get some work done around your house if you have the power to feed it. To get the max output out of this, you're going to need a 50 amp circuit. There's no question about it. Even better, if you could find what's known as a Hobart Stickmate, that's a far better welder. Here's one that's for sale locally to me for 150 bucks. I believe it's a 235 amp machine, has a little bit more adjustability on the amperage output. This thing sitting in a garage where its portability isn't a concern and you have a 50 amp breaker will probably take care of anything stick welding you need to do. They run 6010 okay from what I remember. They don't have like hot start or any features, which is why like this isn't placing higher on the list. But this for 150 bucks is so much better than any of the previous welders. Which brings up a very important point, and that's it's not a bad idea to look at used welders. Older Tombstones and stuff last forever, so buying it used, as long as you can test it before you buy it, you're probably not going to have much of an issue with it. It's a very good way to get a quality welder that'll last you a long time for very little money. Coming in at number 6 is a real man's Tombstone, the Ideal Art 250. This is basically the big industrial brother of the standard tombstone welder. It does AC, DC, very simple, no hot start, no features. It has a crank handle, so the amp output is actually more variable than the transformer tap style of the smaller tombstone. But these things literally are indestructible. This thing here probably sat in some shop being used 10 hours a day for 40 years and it still likely works. So if you have a garage where your welder's just going to sit on the floor and not get moved ever, this is a welder you want. There's also a Miller Dial Arc 250 that is a little bit easier to adjust amperage on, but they're very similar. They're transformer-based machines. This right here is a newer version of the Dial Arc 250. These machines have some serious drawbacks. The first one is weight and size. I mean, they weigh 400 pounds, so if you buy one of these, bring a few buddies to load it in the back of your pickup truck. The second one is they draw an unbelievable amount of power. To get max output out of these machines, which is actually around 300 amps, is somewhere around a 90 amp service that you need to feed it. So that's pretty crazy. On a standard 50 amp 240 outlet, you're going to get somewhere around 220, 230 amps. So that's something to consider. You need a ton of power. And obviously they're not portable. You're not bringing this over to your friend's house. But in the right circumstance for a shop where you need a welder that's going to sit somewhere, you're not going to beat these things. They will literally last forever. And they actually don't cost that much. I've seen the older Ideal Arc 250s and the older Dial Arc 250 selling for as little as $150. Typically they sell for $200 to $350. Not a bad deal for what you're getting. Just understand the limitations. Coming in at number 5 or halfway through the list is the Lincoln Invertech 155 stick welder. I've used one of these before and it's a great little unit. Super light, stick welds great, has soft and crisp modes for running different electrodes. I never ran 6010 with it. I believe it will run 6010. Verify with Lincoln that it will. Now, I would place this higher, but its cost is pretty extreme. These things sell new for like $1,300 to $1,400, partially because it offers a lift TIG mode, so you can TIG weld pretty easy with these things, and that's part of the reason why the cost is high. But if you can pick up one of these used that works for cheaper, not a bad way to go. Much more portable than a lot of the previous welders we've seen. Quality's very high, resale's very high, and they just weld decent. So number 5 is a pretty good spot for this. Coming in at number 4, and probably a bit of a controversy at that, is Harbor Freight's Titanium 225 stick welder. I owned one of these and used it for a while until some crackhead stole it, but you know, he's in prison right now, so I guess that's a good thing. But anyways, these things weld really good. Their DC output, they will run 6010 very good. Super light, super portable. They will run on 110 or 220. The output is, like I said, really good. I really like mine. I would still own one if it wasn't stolen from me. One thing I will say is the stinger, the electrode holder, and the ground clamp are a bit chintzy or cheap with it. There's no features to adjust. I do believe the machine has hot start on it, however, because it seemed to have crispy starts. And the price, you can't beat it. Somewhere between $240 and $280, depending on coupon and sales and stuff. You really can't beat it for that money, honestly. The main downside really being that the warranty on it isn't really the best, but I guess you could always buy Harbor Freight's extended warranty. But yeah, you can get a lot done with this, and honestly, this would be one of my first choices on a budget. I mean, you're not going to get much more welder and have portability and dual voltage control anywhere else. Coming in at a solid number 3, the Miller CST280. Now this is a very serious stick machine. It's capable of 280 amp output on a 50 amp 240 volt circuit. It will run on 3-phase, but I don't think a lot of you guys have 3-phase power. This machine, very simple, no digital display. It just has an on-off switch, amperage dial, and then it has a really nice feature of soft and crisp in the center dial where you can adjust that based on if you're running 60-10 or 70-18. It's nice to have the ability to tailor the arc to how you like it. And like I said, this is a very serious stick machine. It can also TIG weld and use a foot pedal. So if you want a higher output, higher amperage, still somewhat portable machine, this is a way to go. It just doesn't do dual voltage as far as running on 120. But this in a home shop, anything you'd ever want to stick weld, trust me, this will be able to do it without a problem. I mean, you could run possibly 1/4-inch rods with this, which as a home gamer, I generally don't come anywhere near that, so I doubt you will. But seriously, look at one of these used. They don't make them new. You have to buy them used. They sell for between $700 and $800 generally in decent shape. Try it, make sure it works, and then put it in your shop and use the hell out of it. Trust me, you won't be disappointed with this thing. Coming in at a solid number 2 is the ESAB Rogue 130 and 180. I would prefer the 180 just because of the higher amperage. I owned one of these and used it for a better part of a year before I sold it to go to a different, bigger welder. But these things are awesome. Super portable, very well made, very easy to carry around because of a nice solid carry handle. The stinger and electrode holder are awesome. It has hot start that's adjustable. It has arc force that is adjustable. They run 60-10 beautifully. There's really, I can't say too much good about these things. The duty cycle's decent when you start getting up near 180 amps. I never had mine kick out, but the duty cycle drops significantly. But for a home shop welder, you really can't beat this. I mean, most of you guys aren't going to be using rods bigger than 1/8 or maybe 5/32, which the 180 amp version of this will run all day long without much trouble. And the small size dual voltage capability allows you to be portable, so you can bring it to a friend's house, no issues. I also had a lift arc TIG set up with mine, and it worked great. I mean, it did exactly what I wanted it to. There is a foot pedal available for it for TIG as well. I didn't have that. But for the 850 for the bigger 180 amp, and I think the smaller one's 600, you really can't go wrong with these. For your average person in a shop, your home shop, I'd highly recommend these for stick and for lift arc TIG. Coming in at number 1 is the MaxStar 161. This is the S model, stick only. They have STH and STL for TIG models. I own the STH. So anyways, these things are unbelievably awesome. They're lighter than anything else out there for the power output. I mean, they weigh like 17 pounds, extremely small. They weld great. I mean, they have a 60-10 and 70-18 mode. They have stick stuck, so if you stick the rod, it shuts the output off. And like I said, I mean, I owned one of these for 2 years, and it's probably the only welder I ever regret selling. For portable jobs and bringing it over to a friend's house, I mean, it welded it with TIG, and the TIG model I had every bit as good as my Dynasties that I've owned. So awesome for that. And stick, I repaired trailers, all sorts of stuff with it. You really can't beat it. Now the output's only 161 amps, but for most repairs, that's going to be enough. And like I said, the portability end of things is really why you would buy this. The case it comes with kind of sucks. It's pretty big and bulky. I didn't end up using it a whole lot. Price-wise, these things generally sell new, I think, for the stick-only model at about $1,200 or $1,300, and then used, you can generally pick them up for around $800 or so. And I understand that's a lot of money, especially for the output this has. But before you knock the price, actually use one of these. Trust me, you would love it, mainly from the portability end. And my recommendation really would be, if you need more power output or the portability doesn't matter, go and get the CST 280, a used one of those, because you have more output. I want to give a couple bonus ones. Now this is a Fronius Transpocket 180. I've never actually used a Fronius welder. I've heard tons of great things about them, that they're pretty much on par with the higher end welders like Miller. So this guy here has all the features of the MaxStar 161, including like stick stuck. It can also TIG weld. I've heard great things about it, but it's hard for me to recommend it when I've never used it or anything else from the company. So if you have used this or have any thoughts, feel free to leave them down in the comment box. But this is something to look at if you're looking for a higher end stick and possibly lift arc TIG capable machine. Price wise, they seem pretty pricey, similar to the Max Star, so you're talking $1,200 to $1,400. Another honorable mention is the Miller or Hobart branded 160 Thunderbolt, so 160 amp. They also have, I think, a 210 higher amperage. These things kind of have a bad rap because they're priced pretty high despite not having a lot of features. But the awesome thing is you can buy these on a used market in great shape for like half of what they are new. This is actually a well put together machine that'll last you years. Much better put together than cheaper machines. And for the used price, you can generally get them for close to what the Harbor Freight titanium sells for. So it's a thought, you know, if you want a pretty quality machine with not a whole lot of features, buy one of these used, don't buy it new. They do claim they run 60-10, but the one that I used, and from what everyone else has said, yeah, it doesn't run 60-10 that well. So more or less your 60-13 and 70-18. Well, it's about coffee time. I'm gonna go and get myself a decent cup of coffee from somewhere. Hopefully you learned something or you got some ideas for your next stick welder. I know this went a pretty long video and real in depth for everything, but I'm pretty confident in my recommendations. I mean, honestly, if I was gonna pick one out of all of those to just have in the shop as stick only, I think the CST 280 is probably your best bet if you have 240 volts. There's no doubt it will take care of anything you want to. Very simple setup, very high power output. It's still portable. It's just not dual voltage for lower voltage, but awesome, awesome welder. That's realistically my recommendation. Otherwise, you know, you can always pick up a used TIG welder like a Miller Dynasty 200 or any number of them. They also stick weld as well. So that's something to think of. You know, this video didn't really cover any of the multi-purpose or TIG machines that can stick. It's just stick only machines. If you really need a portable machine and good stick performance and you're on a little bit of a budget, but you know, not like Harbor Freight budget, that ESAB Rogue, I'm telling you, go and get yourself one of those. Like, you're not gonna beat that. You know, that's for more portable unit, go with that. For less portable, CST 280, a used one of those. And then if you got the money to spend and you want, you know, the most portable, best of the best stick welder for portability type jobs, that Miller 161S is the way to go. Trust me on it. Use it, you will be blown away. Keep in mind, if you buy one of those used or any of the welders used, there typically isn't any warranty, so they can be pretty expensive to fix. I mean, when you're buying them old transformer machines, they'll last forever. Like, who cares about a warranty? It's already 50 years old. It's gonna last another 50. But yeah, so there you have it. If you got any comments or any welders you really like, put them in the comments so other people can see it. You know, this is, it's important to me to hear what you guys say because I oftentimes omit or don't think of stuff, so I learn and other people can learn too from your comments. Anyways, video's long enough. I'm gonna cut it off here. Thanks for sticking around, guys.